All righty, Peter, it's been a while.
It has. Yes, it has.
It's been, I think, over a month now since our last episode.
Well, it matters who you talk to. It might be too short for one of us. So
that's true. Well, so today we've been working on this episode. I've been trying to line this up for a while. Was hoping to get it before General Assembly, but we've got a special guest on today. And you know what? Before we even introduce him, it's been a long time since I've just done our intro to the podcast for the audio version, but we just want to welcome you to Sound Engagement. This is a podcast devoted to engaging with our culture and community from a Christian worldview. I'm Brad Mills.
I'm Peter
co-host
Anderson.
Peter Anderson. It's all good. And our special guest, SooSang Park. I'll let him pronounce his name a little bit more accurately than I can, but I said SooSang, which is close, right?
It's pretty good.
So, well, Peter, why don't you go ahead and introduce him with the notes that we have there, and then we'll jump right in.
Well, we have a special guest with us today. We've been looking forward to having this conversation. As Brad said, we wanted to try to get it before the General Assembly. Some of you all don't know what the General Assembly is. It's just something that the Presbyterian Church of America puts up, I believe, once a year. Is it once a year? Yeah, and to vote on various issues. And he is the lead pastor of Revive Presbyterian Church in Sunny Valley, California. Sunnyvale. Oh, okay, not Sunny Valley. That's giving it too much too much of a positive aspect. And in the Bay Area. And SooSang is a Bay Area native and a graduate of Stanford University outside of California. He's lived in Boston, where he met his wife, Grace, and in Philadelphia. He also studied theology and ministry at Harvard and Westminster Seminary. The Parks have 3 children, reside in Cupertino. Isn't that where Apple is?
That's where it is.
That's where it is. Yes. Whenever I see my Apple phone, it's what. Yeah. And they moved there in 2009 and began serving in the church out of which Revive was planted. Among other things he enjoys, he is particularly interested in connecting the gospel to the culture. So welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Great being here.
Yeah.
All right. So SooSang and I are in the Northern California Presbytery, and we serve together actually on the Racial Reconciliation Committee that we formed. I believe it's been a year and a half, maybe 2 years. But we started talking about the racial reconciliation issue and just found ourselves aligned on some things. And so I reached out to him, had a longer, lengthier conversation, found out he was a huge fan of Thomas Sowell. And so then we started talking about that and just cross-cultural ministry in general. And I thought maybe a way to kind of do this conversation would be to tie all those threads together, which is to first of all address what happened at the General Assembly. I think some of that will set up what we would talk about with Thomas Sowell, which is kind of a critique of the culture, or our nation's response to cultural issues. I largely see that as what Sowell does in his books on culture. You guys may inform me better on that, but he's got his economic books where he's an expert, and then when he deals with the race and culture issues, it seems like he's largely critiquing things and not necessarily proposing a better response. He's just sort of critiquing. But anyways, we'll talk about that some, and then I thought we would close out with which SooSang, you've done a lot of research on these various topics, especially in terms of how it affects your ministry. And so I thought you could share with us some of those resources, why they've been helpful, how we can be thinking about this a little more directly related to the church, which is something that maybe Sowell doesn't go from that angle. So that's kind of the outline of the topic. We'll open up with PCA General Assembly. We'll go into Thomas Sowell. Then we'll end with some resources or recommendations for how maybe a better approach to cultural issues. And obviously, as always, Peter and I just sort of will go on tangents. You're welcome to take whatever tangent you like as well. And we'll just have fun together. But I thought I'd lead this first section here on the General Assembly. I personally was really happy with the results of the assembly. I know we've briefly mentioned, there's some mixed response on your end, but back on episode 18, Peter and I discussed queer theory, and we brought up in that episode the topic of side B Christianity. And just to remind our listeners, those who aren't familiar with that discussion, right? Side B Christianity is really has to do with the Christian view of homosexuality. One is that homosexuality is not a sin to practice it. It was mainly just a cultural prohibition at the time. If any scriptural prohibitions, it's not relevant today. So you can be a practicing homosexual and a Christian. That would be side A Christianity. That's rejected. That's not something in our denomination that's acceptable. But side B Christianity is something that's had a broader discussion happening really since Revoice took place. I think it was 2018. That opened up this discussion about whether or not you could be, quote unquote, a gay Christian, sort of identify yourself with that, not the practice of homosexuality, but with the desires, same-sex attraction. You could identify with that, but then commit yourself to remain celibate. And so there are SSA, or same-sex attracted ministers in the PCA. More of them have spoken up about this issue, and yet they say they're committed to celibacy. They're committed to not following the cultural response to this. But they also view the church as being a little too harsh and hardened in its view of even rejecting people who have a desire. There's obviously more nuance to that, but that's the idea, is that kind of there's what I see as equivocating on the issue, whereas we want to draw a clear line in the sand, at least, and that I think what happened at the General Assembly. So the first thing we did was we looked at the study committee report. There was a study committee on human sexuality, overwhelmingly passed. Very few people were opposed to it, and it passed only by a show of hands. So I don't think we had an official vote tally on that, but it was, I saw like a smattering, like maybe 5 or 6 hands up it was very minimal out of the 1,800 people voting at the time. So, and then there's that committee report was sort of where we wanted to start with. Let's look at the other overtures related to this topic based upon our large consensus of agreement on the human sexuality report. On one side, you had people who thought the human sexuality report was good, but didn't go far enough, and that it didn't recommend anything. Most study reports in the PCA have a recommendation at the end. Mm-hmm. They say, here's some things you should do to begin implementing this. This one didn't. And so people saw that as a flaw. Others saw that as an advantage, right? They said, well, every Presbyterian session can decide how to use it in a way that suits their ministry and helps them. On the other side, there was the idea that you'd have basically the exact same challenges that we're currently facing on this topic, where there's not a consensus among presbyteries. There's not a consensus at all among churches. And there was a desire to find more unity among churches on a position on same-sex attraction. So that was where those folks advocated for an amendment to the BCO. And so there were several overtures related to that amendment. It narrowed it down to basically 2, Overture 37 and Overture 23. Mm-hmm. Overture 23 passed with more support than 37. I think there was something like 78% passed 23. They liked the wording better than Overture 37, which passed with like 62% on the floor. So still good, strong support for the overtures, but 23 had better support. And I know I don't want to get too deep into each one of those overtures. You can look them up, but I did agree that I think Overture 23 had better wording and language than 37. And I thought the minority report for Overture 37 was simply trying to align the 2 overtures with language amending the BCO. Again, that kind of gets confusing to talk about, but I was in agreement really, I didn't see any problem with the minority report either. I'm still waiting for a better explanation of why people were strongly in favor of 37 and opposed to the minority report. But basically, I thought, as most people did, that the ad interim committee report on human sexuality was excellent, but that it needed these BCO amendments in order to provide some enforcement, some opportunity to enforce those views, rather than simply being pious advice. It's like every presbytery could do with it what they wanted. I thought there needed to be something more done. What do you think about that, SooSang? Sorry, that was a long explanation, but I wanted to give people an overview.
Well, like I thought the human sexuality report was just superb too. And my kind of take is I actually think the amendments are just a little too soon. And so I'm actually not wild about amendment, the wording of, the revised wording that they voted on in 23. I think it's unclear, and I don't think it's going to help lead toward unity. I can see how some of the presbyteries would read it like, hey, this guy has same-sex attraction, he can't be a teaching elder. Okay. Whereas some people would say, well, this guy has same-sex attraction, but he doesn't consider an identity that you can embrace, but you should fight it, in the spirit and remain celibate. And, I'm in favor of that position. I think we have to have a carve out for that we have. And in fact, I would go so far as to say we need teaching elders who, I know some people won't like this language, maybe suffer from same-sex attraction, but it's unwanted. It's not something they want. And they wouldn't go around and say, I'm gay. Or I've heard some people say, I know a brother-in-law, he's not a pastor, he's not a teaching elder. He's an older guy, and he left the gay lifestyle a long time ago, in the early 90s. And today he would call himself a homosexual Christian. But when you listen to him, you're talking about a guy who's in his late 50s, and that was the language he used back then. Homosexual meant that I have same-sex attraction, but he would in no way say, I'm gay, like I embrace a lifestyle, or approve of that choice of identity, or even say that having that desire is not sin. He would say that. So in that sense, he would be very much, as far as I'm concerned, biblically orthodox. But I think we need teaching elders who can confidently, in this context, in this time, say, hey, I have this thing. I don't want it, but I want to live biblically. And I think it's important that we have people who could say, and in ways that speaks to especially young people today, who want to say, hey, I have this feeling, and since my feelings tell me everything of who I am, because that's what postmodernity basically is, isn't it wrong to tell people that, because if sexual desire is a way that our identity has to be completed and fulfilled, that's the tag word, that isn't it bad and wrong to say that you are, people who have this belief. I think we need to have some really important voices in the church that can say, hey, I experienced that, but I've chosen something better. Jesus is better, right? And we have examples of that. We have say Sam Alberry. I actually really respect Sam Alberry. I wish there was a PCA example like Sam Alberry, right? And and a non-white example like Sam Alberry. I know we're going kind of lot. Let me say one more thing about this.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, do you know, just briefly, do you know Stephen Moss? Do you know about Stephen Moss and his story? Because that would be pretty. He is in the PCA. He's not ordained, but he was one of the co-founders of Revoice, who recently basically stepped away from that because he's repenting. He recognizes he didn't really understand concupiscence. He has rejected the idea that his desire is okay as long as he doesn't act upon it. He now understands that even the desire is sinful, and that he worked through those issues with some pastors in the Missouri Presbytery, which helped him to see that and come to that conclusion, which I think was a really helpful interview. But if you're looking for someone who's maybe an example of Sam Alberry's position in the PCA, I think he'd be close to it. He was not a fan of the overtures either. But I actually think it's out of frankly, and I know this is sort of a buzzword that is overused, but I do think it's out of a fear that he'll be targeted rather than simply recognizing that what was being targeted, if you want to use that language, is those who would identify themselves with that sin so as to legitimize the desire.
Yeah, and I see that's when I read it, I don't feel like there's clarity on that. Okay. Like I don't think there's clarity on that. I was sitting with some of the brothers in our presbytery. They sure didn't read it that way. And they did feel like some of that language was targeting people who have like same-sex attraction to say, hey, you have no pathway to be a teaching elder. And that's where I don't like this. And this is what I mean by like, I think we need a little bit more time to digest. I thought that report on human sexuality by the I thought it was superb. And there's a portion in there that explicitly says, don't be too quick to judge people on their language. Just as I mentioned my friend who's like closer to boomer age, and he uses the term homosexual Christian. I wouldn't use that term. I think it's too confusing, right? Which
is what the report says too.
Right. And he himself, I think, would mean, well, I have same-sex attraction, but in no way do I think that that's a legitimate, that is not, that is.
It's an allowable.
Exactly. It's not biblically licit. It's biblically illicit. And so that's the space. And we're looking for a language to say that. I mean, like if it was up to me, I would say we should be able to say someone is a same-sex attracted Christian, but I wouldn't like it if a person said I'm a gay Christian or I'm a homosexual Christian, right? Because I think same-sex attracted is starting to, in our culture, starting to like signal, I have these feelings, but don't assume that I believe in the gay agenda or believe, whereas like the term gay or even homosexuals is getting more and more kind of a neutral, like descriptive term too.
Right.
But what we need is something kind of like close to a neutral descriptive term that doesn't have like a religious theologically laden worldview inside of it that's opposed to the scriptures. And that's kind of like, we're not there yet in our culture, but we're not even there in our church. So I would like to get to that. And it kind of reminds me of the early church when, is it hypostases? That word's like, what is person? What's the conceptuality of a person, in the doctrine of the Trinity? And really, it's like this new, it's a concept that's actually being kind of demanded by biblical doctrine. But the language of the time is kind of inadequate to offer, a precision of language. And I think we're kind of in that kind of a space. And some of it is, it's because the culture, there are basically heretics. That's what I would call them, heterodox. They call themselves Christians, but they want to carve out some space. Like a few years ago during the Revoice, you had this thing called spiritual friendship. I remember reading that and going like, like, no, we can't. That's just that's confusing. But I'm very much in favor. We need a position of somebody who can say, I have same-sex attraction, but I gladly, willingly, proudly live for Jesus in full obedience to the scriptures and don't seek sexual fulfillment in the way our culture seeks it. That's kind of my hope. And I didn't feel like that language was clear enough.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I teach psychology and I'd Endicott over here. And one of the things that often I see in most psychology books, especially the ones that aren't ideological either, they've done a lot of studies that men who are attracted to other men, the likelihood of them being attracted to women is very, very, very low. And I used to think, okay, how can I see this as a Christian? Now for women, it's actually much higher for them to quote switch over to the opposite sex.
I heard that too.
Yeah. And I invite that as research. I think two things can be true at once. I think you can, I know people in my life who are believers, who are Christians, who have same-sex attraction, very high same-sex attraction, and they've never, ever had attraction toward women. And they've served the Lord and loved the Lord for 20 plus years. Yeah. And it's a burden. It is a burden for them. And the work they do in one particular person who does go to our church has just been amazing. I mean, he has reached out to like just hundreds of people in the community. And yeah, he would identify himself first as a believer, though. I mean, he would not, and he doesn't. And I do like that, because we do live in such a culture where identity trumps, our faith in Christ, and he would never say that. But it is a struggle, and and I do think we in the church need to invite that. Right.
Okay.
Well, one thing I just want to say is the passage that comes to mind is some are born eunuchs and some are made eunuchs, right? Mm-hmm. And, obviously it's not really a super attractive verse in our context, but a lot of people just underestimate the fact that sexual desire, sexual fulfillment, it's an idolatry of our time. And of course, people are trying to turn this into an identity, but like, I don't know if a guy who wasn't interested in women like 50 years ago or 100 years ago or something like that would have been like labeled gay. Oh, that guy's gay. He like sets off my gaydar. Like that's the way people talk today. But like, like everybody has kind of had that single, you got that single uncle who for whatever reason never seemed to want to get married. And, let's say you're in Korea, it's a highly patriarchal and super family oriented culture. And someone like that 50 years ago or 100 years ago, I don't even think nobody would even blink at that. There's just like, like assume that he has to be gay and be attracted to a man in a sexual manner. In fact, most people wouldn't even assume that, because that whole sexual aspect of it, the culture wasn't baptized essentially in sexual lust all the time. And this belief that sexual desire has to be fulfilled in a certain kind of way, and somehow you're less human, or your life is not as fulfilled. So I don't know how in our post-sexual revolution time we could ever get back to something more balanced like that. I think something like that is more balanced. And we need to get to something like that, where somebody who doesn't particularly want to be with, you're a man, doesn't want to be with a woman in a sexual way, that you're not broken or weird in any or lacking, that maybe you're just gifted. Actually, you're gifted, right?
And I would say that's like just one tiny little thing that's actually occurring in a lot of churches, especially liberal churches. I forgot the person's name. He was saying, he was basically saying that open marriages are should be honored before the Lord, basing his evidence on stuff from Esther Perel. And, so this is just one teeny little blimp on the radar on when you look at sexual identities and, genders and whatnot, on what's acceptable. I mean, same-sex attraction, that's one thing, but are we prepared for all of the other stuff the culture actually wants to take the church, or vice versa?
We're way past that now. Like,
I feel like that's like old school news. I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, not that report wasn't important. It was, but it's also, it could be seen as a little dated, I guess. It could be. I don't know. Yeah.
No, you'd have to read it. I thought it was really, really helpful.
Yeah, I didn't read it. Yeah, I don't want to make any judgments. Yeah.
The authors of it were pretty broad. They actually had two of the authors are same-sex attracted. And then they had Tim Keller, Kevin DeYoung. Some of those are the two bigger names that I recall on the committee. But anyways, it was a well done report. But in the end, we're going to keep talking about this. I know it's going to be addressed in our presbytery, and those BCO amendments will come up. The next step is for those amendments to pass 2/3 of the presbyteries. So that's a pretty big hurdle. There's 88 presbyteries, which means at least 59 will have to pass these amendments. And, my guess is there are a good number, a dozen or so, that'll immediately reject them. Ours is probably leaning in that direction already. But I'm going to speak in favor of them at our presbytery. There's probably a good 24 or so that are immediately going to pass them without much debate. But I think there's a large chunk of presbyteries in the middle there that'll determine this issue. And so we'll keep talking about it, but let me move on, because that really was just a side note that I wanted to address that was leading us to the issues that we've most recently been talking about in our podcast, which is critical race theory. There were two issues still on the topic of General Assembly that were recommending study reports on white supremacy and critical race theory, or CRT. Those were soundly also rejected by show of hands, maybe a higher number definitely a higher number reject or were interested in it than in the human sexuality report. But the fact that our moderator, Roy Taylor, didn't have to go to a counted vote shows that it was such a significant majority opposed to the reports, to the study committees, that it passed by show of hands, or they were rejected by show of hands. So I do think we could have made a statement to reject critical race theory, especially because I think in terms of its influence, it doesn't seem to be dying away. It seems to be gaining a foothold within the church. And I think we do probably need to say something against it as a denomination. It does seem to me, though, that the vast majority of our denomination is opposed to it. And that became clear at this General Assembly. So our churches, might appreciate a denomination taking a strong stance against it. But in the end, I think we're glad that there wasn't a need to spend $15,000 to study the issue or the topic and then come back with a report about it. What are your thoughts on those particular study committees, or did you have any leaning on this?
I mean, I probably would agree with you. I would like there to be a good nuanced and theologically informed statement repudiating critical race theory. I'm not okay. I mean, I'm going to probably make some of my Asian friends mad. I mean, I'm very strongly against critical race theory. Okay, so and I don't generally like the overall tenor of our country right now, where people who are non-white have to they want to position themselves as somehow victims over some kind of oppressive white majority. I just don't believe that, and I don't think that's even good for minorities. And it's certainly bad for civic unity in all kinds of ways. So that's my general take on something like that. And so I'm not wild about the church getting kind of caught up in wanting to, end up in what I think is overly a guilt-laden, kind of like a secular guilt-laden form of religion, by our culture. And I think the gospel has far better resources, and we should stick to the gospel and seek unity in Christ, not so much look for some type of politically kind of external, extrinsic demand on a certain kind of conformity on issues of race that's going on in America right now.
Yeah.
I think it's also good that probably define, everybody keeps saying, well, that's not really critical race theory, and this is really what I keep seeing that, and I have the definition right up in the Britannica, if I could use that it's an intellectual movement, loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biological grounded feature of physical distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. CRT holds that law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inadequacies between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. So I like to give that definition because there are a lot of people that say, well, that's not really CRT. We're not really proposing CRT. But the minute you state that disparities equal discrimination,
right?
You're an advocate of CRT. It's that simple. The minute you say, well, this is because the minute you use the word white privilege, you're proposing CRT. The minute you say the reason of the housing market is because of racism, well, it's because of CRT. And that's where you and I, we start, and Brad, when we start talking about Thomas Sowell, he was my red pill on just demolishing a lot of the arguments that I had assumed that were true. So I think people, like a cult, like just what you were talking about earlier, the LGBT agenda, it needs to be very dissected, because you could just say stuff without even realizing that you're a proponent of something. You could say, I'm a gay Christian, for example, naively, without even realizing that's coming from queer theory and maybe a little bit of Judith Butler and whatnot. or even saying that gender and sex are two totally different things, which again is coming from queer theory. No scientific evidence for that. And yet if you ask the person, why are you the queer theorist? They'll say, well, no, I've never read anything by queer theory. Right. And I think people, it's like, I like to say that because the actual definition that you can just read online, you know, the minute we start saying that there are power groups and there's oppressor versus oppressed, and a lot of that has to do with white consciousness. And I could just talk to Christians. It's amazing the number of Christians that I speak to or talk to. They just kind of say things, just these assumptions. And then I ask them, why are you proposing critical race theory? And well, I'm not a critical race theorist. You know, so I do think definition can really help, you know. So anyway, my little 2 cents there, but
good.
Just wanted to define it. So
yeah, no, this is helpful. The last group of overtures I wanted to address with General Assembly, then we'll move on, is just the issue of, or those overtures that had to do with Asian American Pacific Islander hatred. So you had 2 overtures that Atlanta proposed, really one overture that Atlanta proposed, and then it was recommended by another presbytery, just the same one. And those both were rejected. I can't remember I think those were also just rejected by a show of hands, but they were not rejected. What they were was they were referred to the Overture 48, which was proposed by the Korean Presbytery, I think Korean Capital Presbytery or something like that. So we'll get to that one. But the first thing was just the idea of, which we talked about a few episodes ago, Peter and I think they had proposed that, you know, 5 Asian Americans be placed in a position within the, I think, M&A to study the topic of anti-Asian hatred and sort of promote a history of Asian American in ministries and various resources for the church. And all of that was rejected. I think it was good. I was in favor of the General Assembly's response because I did think the statement itself was selective. It was partial regarding sort of who deserves our weeping. You know, like we should weep with those who weep, and it will rejoice with those who rejoice. There's a lot of people weeping over injustices the last 18 months, and so to highlight just one demographic, I thought was unhelpful. And then secondly, I thought it would set a precedence that sort of, we're going to be a denomination that follows the culture on these issues. And if a hot button issue comes up, we're going to make a statement that sort of aligns ourselves with the culture so we can win some points there. At least that's the way I saw it, was sort of virtue signaling. So the only virtue signaling I was ever a fan of was when we had the initial response to the droughts in California, and it was like, don't wash your car. And it's sort of like you could signal your virtue that you were in favor of not washing your car, in favor of saving water by driving around in a really dirty car. So it's just, it just gave way for me to be lazy on that area. Any other virtue signaling?
I mean, on those parts, I read through those overtures, and in general, I don't like the spirit of those overtures for a lot of the similar reasons that you're saying. I mean, I don't know, if a bunch of people shoot a bunch of Hispanic folks tomorrow, do we have to have a whole nother set or something? You know, you're saying what I'm saying? Right. And I also didn't like kind of the heavy-handedness, like take it to the assembly. The assembly has to appoint 5 guys. I mean, like, well, if you really want that, you don't have to do it this way. I mean, you could do a little more bottom up. Why don't you go to CDM and say, hey, can we get some more Korean guys on this? And I mean, like, and they'll be like, yeah, sure, let's do that. Right. You know, and like, so like, I think there are ways you could get maybe more Asian voices or perspectives in places like that without, you know, having to make it a big, you know, to do with the whole, you know, at the assembly like that. But in general, I mean, okay, let me make a big, broad statement, which I think will also relate to Sowell. I'm very against this whole idea of looking at people according to their race. In general, I think it's a very much a reductionism. Like, like, do you guys see yourself as European Americans? I mean, are you European Americans? So, like, I don't really. The fact that I'm Asian it's not really a part of my identity. It's more like a descriptor. Okay. My ancestors come from over there. And what else does it mean that I have like straight black hair and slanted eyes? Is that all it's saying? Right. But in my actual like, self-understanding and in a meaningful identity, like of who I am, it's actually culture, not race, So like, I have Korean ethnic heritage, right? As far as I know, I'm 100% Korean by blood, right?
Yeah.
As far as I know, anyway.
As far as you know, yeah.
And and so like that's a substantive part of my identity, but I really am Korean American. Like when I hang out with first generation, they feel I'm pretty American, right? And so, but then when I'm American, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm white? Right. Like in my I have this joke that I like this. I said this in front of my congregation. I'm like, 35% Korean and 40% white and like 15% want to be Mexican and 10% confused.
Yeah.
and my congregation laughs when I say that, but I'm only kind of half joking when I say that, because I'm actually giving what I consider to be something like an objective description of my cultural makeup, right?
I would even argue that if you have everybody, like a whole bunch of Koreans, for example, a whole bunch of white people, a whole bunch of blacks, studying a particular issue, that's actually more of a concern because, bringing psychology again, one thing that psychology has actually proven is the problem with in-group bias. And, so the question, we are very tribal in our nature, and that's what bias. And Daniel Kahneman wrote about this in his new book called Noise, which is fascinating. He talks about how bias and noise often come in, and that's one of the reasons why we make very poor judgments. Whenever there's groupthink, you are going to make significant more error by trying to force it to say something that it doesn't necessarily say. You get a whole bunch of fundamentalists in the room, and you're going to force Genesis 1 to say a certain way, when the text, I don't know where y'all stand on this, but might not quite say exactly the way it is. Right. And vice versa, and so the best way to address these issues is actually not to have everybody in the same, categories, to actually have a lot of people that can challenge groupthink. because I think the question isn't so much how do we get rid of racism as much as how do we decrease or how do we become more aware of our own biases as well as the noise within our own tribe. And I like what you said, because I think psychological studies prove that people really love their tribe and their skin color. And I think that's why you could say Uncle Tom, call somebody like Tim Scott and Uncle Tom, Thomas Sowell, Uncle Tom, all these people. And yet, no one was pointing out Amy Coney Barrett's gender when she was going before the Supreme Court. But everyone wanted to point out RBG's, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's gender, and that's all. When she was passing, not one word about her gender, basically from anybody, from people that disagreed. Why is that? That's like really fascinating. And I think most of the time, prior to making judgments, that's what we do. We like to see which tribe that person is in. Is he wearing a mask? And protecting us, or is he not wearing a mask and he's really just a secret serial killer? And we did that. Psychology's done this. We there was a test that they wanted to, I can't remember the name of the study, but if you're like an intense Red Sox fan and you viewed multiple photos of people who are actually wearing Red Sox jerseys, nobody looks at skin color. They looked at what jersey you were wearing, and the heart rate. They actually looked at the heart rate, and it actually went down significantly. And even people that were minorities, actually, there was more empathy toward those people because they're like, "Oh my God, my brother," But if you looked at Yankee fans, and your heart rate would actually go up, and it's significant. And in one study, male football fans' brains are actually scanned and receiving like this electric shocks through electrodes on the back of their hands when they saw a fellow fan in pain. They actually got very concerned, and regardless of race, so regions associated with empathy were then activated. Actually, and then quite the opposite when they saw the region what was it? Schadenfreude. I hope I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great word.
Region associated with reward would then be activated if the Yankee fan, if they're losing.
That's terrible.
I mean, so I mean, I think that those are some fascinating studies.
Team.
Yeah, I don't know. I like Reds. I'm actually kind of a Cubs guy, but I mean, that would be great. And then what unfortunately, what I notice of a lot of these quote studies, they're not really they're not asking even the right question. So anyway, that's my little,
Well,
I just.
As an aside, I'm a Dodgers fan. What are you, SooSang? You said you like baseball.
Yeah, I'm an A's guy. Red Sox are just evil
Oakland
Empire 2 to me. There's evil Empire 1 on the East Coast and evil Empire, and now we have 2. I guess we have multiple evil empires on the West Coast now. We have
nice.
That's terrible. Don't go there. Don't go there with the Dodgers. All right. So the last one I did want to say, and this one's a little more direct, because you had the General Assembly passed a revised statement in response to the Korean Presbytery Overture 48. It was Korean Capital Presbytery, so titled "Repudiate Anti-Asian Racism." And I learned something interesting after General Assembly, talking to a friend. The overture was submitted by Korean Capital Presbytery. It was championed by one particular church in that presbytery, which is, I believe, in the New York area. And I won't mention names, but the wife of the pastor, who's on the church website as a co-church planter, also works for the Center for Anti-Racism Research at Boston University, alongside Ibram Kendi. We've talked about Jamar Tisby in the past as well, both all working in that same region. So I did think that was an important point to recognize sort of where this overture is coming from. I'm not sure it's an overture that resonates with the vast majority of Korean presbyteries. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, but let me bring up the overture, because, like I said, it's an interesting. It's worded in very directly, very sort of forcefully, and then the response of our overtures committee is just very minimal. So obviously, when it came to the floor, it ended up being rejected. But there was some discussion, the overture committee recommendation was passed, which was a much smaller version of this. So at first I was a little concerned that they were passing anything, but what they passed was a truncated version of this overture. So let me just read it, portions of it. It says, the Bible maintains the Imago Dei and describes every human being with the immense value and dignity of being image bearers of God. Jesus, through his life, death, and resurrection, tore down the dividing wall of hostility between people, who would otherwise be divided by constructs, both natural and social, including ethnicity, gender, age, social class, occupation, and race. You have a long history of anti-Asian sentiment in our nation, exhibited by the massacre in Los Angeles, 1871, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Japanese Americans during World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans, the murder of Chinese American Vincent Chin in 1982. So you have examples there. Of course, what I find interesting is all of these examples are national examples, nothing within the PCA, nothing from the church's involvement in those things. But regardless, the next one says the church at the 30th General Assembly of the PCA adopted a statement on racial reconciliation that confessed covenantal, generational, heinous sins connected with the unbiblical form of servitude. Goes on and on about basically commending the racial reconciliation response. Later on, I think the racial reconciliation report may be mentioned, but they go on to say, because of this rhetoric, there's recent anti-Asian rhetoric fueled by anti-Asian remarks made by influential political and thought leaders. Again, I find that interesting that what they're using as evidence for the need for this overture is strictly cultural. It's strictly the response of our nation rather than any problem within the church itself. There have been over 3,000 reported hate crimes against Asian Americans since March. And there's a long history of our government baselessly scapegoating Chinese immigrants for epidemic outbreaks along the West Coast going back all the way to 1870, resulting in their vilification, destruction of their properties, and even their deaths. Okay, so lastly, I want to go, it does give the specific example of Asian American women who were among the 8 murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. It highlights that incident, which again gives it a racial qualification that may or may not be accurate. And then you have Asian Americans often experience marginalization. So the resolved is this: resolved to that the 48th General Assembly strongly repudiates the sin of anti-Asian racism. And then it gives several additional things, like that the PCA reject and condemn culture of sexual objectification of Asian women, which destroys their inherent status as bearers of the Imago Dei. Be it further resolved, the PCA denounces the use of rhetoric discriminatory against Asians, such as using phrases like Chinese virus outside of academic and journalistic purposes. Be it further resolved that members of the PCA commit to actively denounce anti-Asian rhetoric, racist jokes, mocking, and other actions they witness. Be it further resolved. So it goes on and on about these recommendations that every church should be doing, every Christian within the PCA, and then humbly consider ways, like the close is, humbly consider the ways that we have either explicitly or implicitly contributed to the anti-Asian racism. That language in particular is troubling to me. We've seen that within the idea of critical race theory, this implicit bias. So now we're using CRT language in this overture. And then, so anyways, the last thing I'll just say, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. The Overture 48 was answered in the following way. The report of the Ad Interim Committee on Racial and Ethnic Reconciliation to the 46th General Assembly speaks clearly both to the reality of the Imago Dei in all people and to the sin of racism, particularly when it affirms the vision of the redeemed in Revelation 7, the image of God reflected in all people, the image of Christ reflected in his body. And then at the same time, we recognize the pain and at times violence that Asian American Pacific Islander community has experienced. Particularly due to events of the past year, we express our grief together with our AAPI brothers and sisters over the pain and suffering that has occurred, whether this has happened due to unbiblical religious claims, racist pride, or any other cause. We finally assure our AAPI brothers and sisters of our love and support and of our desire to walk together in ways that reflect the commitments of the Racial Reconciliation Report. All right, so sorry. I wanted to read through that because I think you see some problems in the language of the original overture, and you can see how it was probably the reason why it was championed by the church that championed it. Love to get your thoughts on how it was responded. The danger with this response is that it gives the impression to 20% of our denomination that we don't really want their involvement, right? That was the argument on the floor from some, was that like, we want participation from our Korean brothers and sisters in those presbyteries, but the first time they produce an overture and present it to our denomination, we essentially reject it, or we revise it so much that it's not like anything in the original. What do you think?
I mean, it's a big mess. Okay, I mean, what I mean by that is, like, I don't even know if the majority of the Korean presbyteries, like first generation churches, do they feel like they're being oppressed by white folks in America? I don't feel like they would be aboard that kind of narrative for one. So if there is a portion who wants to speak on behalf of the whole overture and they got the over, I don't know. And there's this other issue going on too in some of the, I used to be in the Korean Southwest Presbytery. There's clearly a first generation, second generation issue going on there, where first generation, they have their own preoccupation. Second generation, they got a different set of preoccupation. And then within the second generation, you got like more progressive and more conservative, whatever, right? So this feels like something out of the more progressive side of a second generation preoccupation. And maybe the first generation said, okay, I want to do this. Okay.
Sure.
And so you can't take that to the bank. That's kind of like,
sure,
I could see that going down in Korean Southwest Presbytery, right? And I was in that presbytery for many, many years. But I mean, of course, a lot of Asians feel like minorities, but this AAPI hatred thing, I mean, I'm not really in favor, like, okay, let's be against AAPI hatred. If you put it that way and you say, well, I'm not really in favor of that, that makes you sound like what? Because you're a racist, you don't care. That's right. The whole thing is kind of like geared to be kind of a form of emotional blackmail. That's how I see it, right? And that's how CRT basically operates. It's like there's a certain kind of feeling that you're supposed to have, and these are the oppressed people. You don't care about oppressed people? If you don't, if you don't show that you have the proper feeling by agreeing with the people who have that stance, then you're a bad, hateful, like insensitive, racist kind of person. And that's the kind of blackmail that's used, not just on race, it's used on sexuality. Anybody who's a minority is oppressed. And so I said this thing earlier. I said, I would love it if America stopped fixating on race and we start trying to get more serious about trying to understand somebody's, like self-professed cultural identity. I think that's really where they're at, right? That's a much more substantive way to try to understand who they are. But a second thing I'd really like to say is, like one of the brothers on the, the TE who was African American, I was really listening to, the future of the PCA. And I actually really love this pastor. When I listened to him, I'm like, gosh, I love this pastor. But he said something in his statement, which was like about if, like he seemed to think that cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism was like just trying to dismiss somebody, like dismiss a point of view. Like, like if you think that white people have been insensitive to black people, and then say, therefore you're more sympathetic to say something like CRT. But one of the things I want to say is I don't think it's a form of dismissal to call it neo. I think the right, some people call it cultural Marxism. I call it neo-Marxist, the new Marxism. And I don't think that's an unfair way of describing them. I don't think that is a dismissal. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If you take their ideas very seriously and understand them on their own terms, it is objectively neo-Marxist. That's really what it is, right? And one of the things I want to say is I didn't learn my neo-Marxism by reading Ibram Kendi or somebody else. I learned it at Harvard, the worst seminary in the whole world, between 1993 and 1996. And they didn't call it neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism at the time. But when I was at that school, this is what it was all about. It was all about, today we would use the language, if you're cisgender, white male Christian, you're kind of like apex predator. You're like the ultimate oppressor, right? And really and today we have this term intersectional, which means you have more of the oppressed markers. You're more of a minority than that person, right? And so, and so any kind of like hermeneutic of culture that looks at like, you got the oppressor and the oppressed. And then there's this kind of movement where if you won't, like just side with the oppressed, and this is what I mean by a kind of emotional blackmail. What you can call it whatever you want. That's Marxism. That is neo-Marxism. That is neo-Marxism. That's exactly its strategy. That's exactly its hermeneutic. You can change the language. You can say like, well, let's talk about lesbians, or how about, the ultimate oppressed person when I was at Harvard Divinity School was like black lesbian feminist. I mean, she's like oppressed on every front. Okay. And that's what it was like. I was like, well, I guess I'm only kind of oppressed because I'm Asian, because I'm male and I'm Christian and I'm heterosexual. And the whole thing was super divisive and is oriented toward anger and hatred and blame, a lot of it, and weaponizing guilt. So much of it was geared toward weaponizing guilt, but there's no pathway toward atonement, forgiveness, reconciliation, a unity of people of different, different backgrounds and different histories, like the Bible teaches. You have like Ephesians chapter 2, you were once far away, but by the blood of Jesus, you have been brought near, and you are made like one house of the Lord. That's the gospel. And all these kinds of like viewpoints that are trying to like pit one set of people over against another by calling one set bad, and then, or like positioning somebody as a historical victim or guilt, or and the other side is guilty. That's neo-Marxism. And so in general, I'm pretty not happy with any of this stuff, but at the same time, it's you have people who do feel excluded, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have people who want to say, could you help include us? And generally, dominant cultures have not been good at that, right? And that's a term I would like to use. I don't want to use the term white versus black. I want to say dominant culture, because that's the reality of it. In any culture, in any time, in any place, whoever kind of has the dominant culture, they're generally not great at being understanding and sympathetic to the minority side. And so this is a way of trying to kind of rectify that, but I think it's a really poor and actually a very spiritually dangerous way.
Mm-hmm. I also felt like they left out a lot of stuff. I mean, they weren't really honest with the data when they were talking about, almost like it was a kind of a slam toward Trump in one of those things. The political leaders, like, who are you talking about? Almost like they didn't say it, but it was almost like looking at it from people who are uber conservative or maybe from white consciousness. There is Asian hate, and Brad and I talked about this, and it predominantly comes from inner city Black neighborhoods. And I witnessed that, I've seen that before, and living in predominant, whenever I remember I lived in Chicago, lived in Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, I can think of 3 instances, once in Chicago where I was just a little kid, and there was talk about Asian prejudice that I saw, heard mainly from Black communities. Mm-hmm. I would have really respected it if they actually said, let's go witness to our Black brothers and sisters or our Black neighbors to help them with their Asian hate. But they weren't willing to do that. That would have been, and I think the reason why is because they would have been really kind of thrown under the bus by the culture and probably deemed as racists. But again, that shouldn't be, if your honor is truth. I mean, the very thing that we as Christians need to be looking at is truth. It's like, we have to be careful of slander, and we have to be careful of mob mentality, because mob mentality put Christ on the cross. That's kind of like one of my little motto right there lately, and it's like, if that is really, okay, so if there is Asian hate, let's look where it is. Asian hate, there is a lot of Asian hate. 95, 98, I forgot what the numbers were, is really coming in predominant high Black neighborhoods. So, okay, let's have the discussion. Why wasn't that in the Westminster, so why wasn't that in there? So they're just kind of like leaving all that out, acting like all these people have to apologize who are predominantly in white people, so that may open up the door to a wonderful ministry opportunity, but that gets completely that's not in the discussion, because I almost felt like they just kind of copied and pasted on Apple's, page, and then just put some Bible verses in there. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, SooSang or Brad.
I mean, I've had Asian friends who basically say that in private too. It's like, hey, a lot of the incidences, they're not coming from white people. The violence isn't coming from white people. And more than a few people I know have noticed that and pointed that out. I've got some friends who, they're not white, and they ask me, they're like, Asians are oppressed. What do you mean? Asians are kicking butt in America. they're going to the best schools. They make more money than white people, on average, and stuff like that. So I have friends who are non-Asian. They're not white, and they're actually confused about this whole idea that Asian people are somehow oppressed in America, because they're like, it doesn't feel that way to me. And so. Again, as I think about it, it's anomalous. It doesn't fit or make sense with the reality and the data, because it fits more like the religious narrative of our time.
Well, it's funny you say that. Yeah, it's funny you say that, because actually at Harvard, there are a lot of Asians who did feel oppressed, mainly through the very argument that the CRT, the way that CRTs views reality according to oppressor and oppressed, because people were looking at that predominantly Asians were going to engineering programs, making significantly more money. Asians do make a whole lot more money in our in a whole lot of cultures. I mean, what is it? So it's not just in America. And Sowell writes a lot about that as well. I mean, all the billionaires in Thailand, and in Indonesia are actually of Chinese ancestry.
Right. They're actually
it's, so, right. And one of the things about the affirmative action lawsuit recently at Harvard University, a lot of Asians actually did feel, that there was prejudice against them. And in that case, rightfully so, based on their skin color and based on, well, you're kind of higher up in the, on the spectrum here.
Well, so I absolutely agree with, okay, probably get in trouble for saying this. I totally agree with the lawsuit. It's straight up racist.
Yeah,
okay?
right.
You're
I do too.
Asian,
Yeah.
therefore, you have to get way higher scores and everything like that. You're not a minority. I mean, like, it's just
it's affirmative action.
Yeah. It's like that. I hope that actually gets to the Supreme Court and finally the Supreme Court say, well, I guess the only way to stop discrimination is to not discriminate. I think that's what Chief Justice John Roberts has been quoted as saying. And I'm like, well, I would have liked it if that was the way we were operating for the last 30 years. That's probably where we really need to. And if you actually poll the vast majority of Americans again and again and again, that's actually what they want. The vast majority of Americans who are not among the quote unquote educated elite, that's what they want. They're just like, hey, just make it fair. Stop judging people according to whatever their skin color is and just make it fair, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that would go a long way to help, but that probably sounds hopelessly naive to some people. Right?
Well, hey, just to clarify, and then I want to turn it over to Peter to talk about Thomas Sowell with you, and I'll chime in as I can. But we're way over.
Yeah,
we're not going to end in an
hour.
We're
already over an hour. Okay.
But just on the idea of the anti-Asian hatred and the violence. So I think there are different data points that are being researched. So those who would say that there is an increase in anti-Asian crime statistics, a lot of those statistics are not limited to violent crime. It's including racial slurs that were said or comments made in conversation, maybe at a workplace, that there was no violence involved, but maybe a joke or something like that was said and then reported. And so some of that, they then say, well, see, it's not just it's a broader spectrum of people oppressing Asian Americans. But when you look at when you narrow it down to just the violent crime, that's when you start to see it's mostly, almost all coming from inner city, urban context, vastly, or I don't know the percentages, but a large percentage of them coming from Black perpetrators. So I just wanted to clarify, because I think if people did research, they would come with, I was trying to figure out what the data was saying, and it all just depends on who you're listening to, right? I mean, you kind of have to do a broader study of the topic to really understand how much of an increase there is. And it does come down to recognizing even the increase in crime, it's coming from a very small number to another small number, but because it's gone from 12 to 20, it looks like percentage-wise, it looks like a massive increase in hate toward Asian Americans. And that's part of the manipulation of the data.
Absolutely.
Right?
So let's take the data as it is. Let's see what good we can actually come from the data, if we can. Okay, so it comes primarily from Black neighborhoods. Okay, my next question would be, what are predominant Black neighborhoods learning about cultures? And why is this hatred coming toward people that they view as successful? So what are we teaching them? So that would be my question. After that, is it coming from kind of a subpar CRT view of the world, which a lot of inner city public schools actually do teach, that says that you are oppressed, you are oppressed, you need to have contempt towards your neighbor? Is that possibly actually what's leading toward a racially diverse lens to view people in categories, which is causing that person to be violent? And so you got to be really careful. It's almost like the PCA report. Are you possibly kind of giving in to the very thing that's actually being promoted in some of these neighborhoods, which are actually feeding the anger in some of these young African-American kids? So you better look at all the facts here before you. This is the problem with cultural bandwagons. You don't know what the heck you might be saying. And you better get on let's really dissect what truth versus untruth is. And anyway, it just kind of, but yeah, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about Thomas Sowell other than the last. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
I think we need to.
Let's say a little something about Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah, I would love to. I know. Great.
Conquest and Cultures.
Yeah, let's do it, because there's some hope there.
It's an older
there's hope
book.
in Jesus. Hope in Jesus. And then Tom.
I mean, almost all his books are total education, and one of the things I just would like. I mean, people people might say he's one of the great Black scholars alive. He's not one of the great Black scholars alive. He's one of the great scholars alive, period.
Yeah,
any
absolutely.
race, ethnicity, period. Okay.
Yeah.
And reading him is a serious education. He's just a few things I want to say. If your audience, you've already heard a little about Sowell through Peter, but one of the incredible things about Sowell is he's just utterly fearless. Okay. He doesn't care what ideology or political agenda, or if you're white or you're Black or you're rich, or he just doesn't care. He's super evidential. He's kind of like, he's really more, he's almost just like, he's like a fixture of another age that's much more deeply into evidential and not kind of into the feelings like we are today. Just this book, let me just say a couple things about this book. I've read chunks. This is the third book of a trilogy he wrote in the 90s. Is Race and Culture, Migrations and Culture, and Conquest and Culture. I read Race and Culture many years ago, and I was like, whoa, this is an amazing book. And then foolishly, I never read the other two books until more recently. After the George Floyd incident, I decided, well, you know what, let's go read the other two books. So I picked up Migration and Culture. It blew me away. I was just, and then I started this one. So let me just say just a couple things about this book. Some things that you'll find out if you read Sowell is disparity almost never proves discrimination. It doesn't necessarily. There can be discrimination with disparity, but disparity, one of the things he shows you and proves to you again and again and again and again, disparity is just completely normal in history. Different cultures just care about different things. Different cultures are good at different things. I mean, like if your culture cares more about math than, like athletics, right? Guess what? The people who are good at athletics are probably going to produce more athletes. And the people who really care about math are going to probably produce a lot more engineers, right? And then he just shows that to you in just example after example. He shows it to you in the migrations. He shows it to you in conquest. There's like the thing that you pointed out, which you'll learn from Migrations and Culture, where a lot of the development that happens, say, in Southeast Asia is by like the Chinese. There's certain Chinese minorities that were oppressed in China. They flee China and end up in Southeast Asia, and essentially they change the whole economics of the whole region because of their industry and of their human capital and their talents and their knowledge. Well, this thing is going on all the time. Like there's a chapter in this book on the British. So we're not talking about white versus Black. We're talking about white people and white people. We're talking about British folks and Romans. And what he talks about is you go into like the British Isles, and here you got the English and the Welsh and so forth, right? And one of the things he points out is one of the things that even to this day makes different portion of the British Isles, different in their culture and some of their strengths is because which parts were occupied by the Romans and which parts weren't. So essentially the parts that were occupied by the Romans, even though, the Romans oppressed them and conquered them and killed some of them. But then what the Romans did was come in and then they brought Roman governance. They brought Roman technology. They brought Roman know-how. They brought Roman writing. So to a people that was more primitive, right? What they got was far more knowledge and human capital. And then over the next couple hundred years or so, the portion that got that, guess what? They became comparatively further ahead than the folks who didn't. To this day, that's still a factor, right? And so just reading that one chapter alone on the British just completely blew. And then what he shows you is, then you go and read about Africa and you'll say, okay, all the development in East Africa. Did you know that I did not know this until I read this. A lot of the most developed places in East Africa, they were first developed by Indians from India and from I forget which European countries. I want to say Portugal, and was it? I forget which was the other one, right? There's like two competing European countries and the Indians. And they competed against each other for the economic and technological, because they had like the greater advantages of those things. And to this day, those cities and those places that had that human capital in their history have disparity over against all the tribes and portions of their country that don't. And so this is a pattern that runs throughout history. And one of the things we wish is that we could make things equal. And by equal today, we really, what today's definition of equal means is equal in result, equal, like equal money. These guys have like the same level of money. These have the same level of like achievement in given realms. But really, that's just not real. What we need to do is get back to something more like the Bible. What we have is an equality in worth before God, made in the image of God. But since we kind of taken God out of our culture, what we want now is like, okay, we got to get equality of like outcome. We have to have equality of outcome and result. But if you look at history is regularly the non-equality of outcome, because just even apart from oppression, soon as people get more human capital, more knowledge, more know-how, whoever gets that, they'll get further ahead. And then what you're going to get a disparity. So it's just impossible to stop that. And the best you can do is to like get certain people that have more privilege or more advantage to walk alongside and win the trust and love of those who have less, just as the Bible calls us to do. But it's not like you're going to just be able to solve it in 1 or 2 generations using some type of a political ideology or agenda. That's one of the great things I wish people can learn from reading and studying Sowell, that like cultures really are so different in what they care about. And then actually this is crazy, is like keeping your culture pure, like we're only going to be inside our own little tribe. Actually, that's a big mistake. There's this beautiful, I should find it for you, but there's this incredible paragraph where he sums up the whole chapter about the British, and he's talking about the British Empire and how they became this incredible dominant empire throughout the world. And then what he does is he then tells you, he lists all the different things that they learned and received from somebody else's culture over the last couple thousand years. So the Brits didn't get all their stuff because they were English or because they were Scottish. The Scots became Scottish in the way that they are today because they gained so much from the Romans or the Arabs and all these other kinds of people. And that's kind of really what we're trying to have in America. And really, it's really one of the great blessings of the West, right? Of the West, if you want to call it that. The West today, in its actual best form, is not even just white and it's not even just Western. It's really like spreading, that knowledge base and stuff is spreading all around the world. And so you get Western universities, but the best Western universities in Korea are, well, the ones started by the Christians. That it's that kind of thing. And now, the Koreans totally own those universities, and they were Western universities. And if you ask me, those universities are Western products, but they weren't like pure Korean products or pure English products. And I wish people would understand that no one set of people has a monopoly on the glories and the knowledge of God. And thus, even something that's like that we would consider painful and bad, like conquest, actually, this is crazy. And it's really hard for, I think, the 21st century postmodern to accept, but conquest actually and throughout history has produced a lot of common grace for a lot of like downtrodden people. That's still going on today. So, okay, I'm saying a lot.
Yeah,
so,
no,
that was good.
Yeah, I was like, that was so good. Well, on what your last point was too. I mean, Johan Norberg wrote a book called Open. It came out in, I think, 2020. He's a Swedish economist, and he talked about that. I mean, and Sowell has mentioned this as well, that the people that actually were supposed to take over the whole world was China, the Ming Dynasty and the Han. I can't remember which dynasty, because they were actually interacting with multiple hundreds of different Romans and different tribes. And then when there was, I think there was a war, maybe it was a pandemic that actually happened and wiped out majority of the population. And the Han Dynasty, I think it was, or the Ming, I can't remember, decided to close all of its borders. But they were significantly so much more advanced as a society because they were inviting a lot of people in. And then the minute they kind of closed all their borders and didn't let anybody else in and just stayed with their own tribe, they basically entered the Dark Ages. But for almost 1,000 years, they were highly more advanced than any other.
Right.
I mean, the Brits were the barbarians. They were
Absolutely.
like we were the cavemen. I mean, talk on British. So I mean, totally backwards and everything. And that's what's really kind of fascinating. About that. I mean, and that's where what he has really taught me, that disparity does not equal discrimination, or causation does not equal correlation, or so the same thing in basic. And that's just, a lot of people don't understand that. And that. the question needs to be too, that, you have to look at, do you have a level playing field that where you can, does this playing field allow you to succeed if you do certain things that will allow you to succeed? And the answer is yes. And I mean, there are multiple cases of that. And one of the things that Sowell has taught me, I didn't know this, but the percentage Blacks were earning a significantly higher percentage of what whites were earning in 1988 than in 1967. That the income and the wage was significantly getting much, much better up until about 1969, even during Jim Crow, which was that was mind blowing to me. Not that you want to go back there at all, but I mean, there was a lot of success, even when there was a lot of suffering that was going on.
Right.
And one of the main reasons for that is because Black households had a high likelihood of staying married,
Right.
teaching discipline and whatnot. The other thing too, that as far as back in 1969, Black males who came from homes where there were newspaper, magazines, library cards, had the same incomes as white males from similar homes, same incomes. That's been going on every single year. Just that little teeny little fact that people don't realize. Just the fact, like Black males who came from homes that there are newspapers, magazines, and library cards. Those three things. Same income as whites that came from the same place. So what is that? And, you could also talk about husband and wife families outside the South earn just as much as husband and wife families outside the South as well. So there are all these little holes that go into the, most people's assumptions that if you see disparity, it must mean discrimination. And Sowell brings that up as well. Like, no, I mean, the disparities have gone down for thousands of years. I mean, if you live near a port, you're highly more successful. So I think, biblical times, Paul talks about
geography.
Paul talks about that in Corinthians, all the temptations that they were facing right there on the port. You had all the temple prostitutes and you had all the high money, all the money and everything else. I mean, there were a lot more, quote, opportunities for those people living near water than there were if you're living on some kind of mountain. That doesn't mean that there's racism. It just means, like, how do we get anyway? Right. But I mean, I think the biggest influence for me was probably Conflict of Visions over all the facts and everything. I think when I read Conflict of Visions, that's where, which is this right here, where he basically says that there's a constrained view versus an unconstrained view. What is your assumption of human nature? And I liked it because it gives us some element of whom we're talking to. Because if you have a constrained view of man, which is there are no solutions or only trade-offs, that we're all pretty selfish, and that's why capitalism actually works, is because it brings a lot more equality in the sense of, there's a lot more accountability. And as a small business owner, you have to be very accountable to your product. Then in those societies, the discrimination lowers quite a bit, and that's why one of the things people at the Deep South, Jim Crow was actually big on big government. And the reason for that is because true capitalism actually worked in the sense that most Northerners who practiced this, back then, a free market kind of enterprise, the discrimination went down significantly because their product went up and their actually income went up pretty significantly. It wasn't because they were less racist than Southerners. It was quite, but anyway, going back on Conflict of Visions, but if you have this view of people that we're all kind of selfish and we need a lot of accountability and there's really no solutions or really more trade-offs, and how do you get that? Then you're going to look for those things that are going to provide the best opportunity for all people. But if you have an unconstrained view of man, in the sense that you think that there are surrogates, i.e. Fauci's and, the experts of your field, I mean, there are people that God bless them, there are therapists that literally will never go beyond what the CDC literally tells them what to do all the time. There are people that live their whole life that way. Unless a surrogate is telling me exactly what to do, I can't live my life otherwise. And so for that view of man, your assumption is that there's a sense of utopia, and these surrogates or these experts, the enlightened ones, the anointed ones. He calls them the anointed ones. Yeah. Anointed. Yeah. They help me along the path. And I think when you're talking to people, what is the presupposition? What's the presupposition on your view of humanity here? And I would probably argue there's a little bit of both, I think, and even Sowell would say that, but he's more on the constrained view. much more so than you could see but there's no either or, but I think you have to acknowledge that, I liked that book because it set the level playing field on that. There are deeper rooted issues on why we disagree about guns, why we disagree about taxes. You have a totally different view of humanity than I do, maybe. And maybe we could talk about that. Anyway, I didn't know if you had read that, and that's been the biggest influence.
That specific book, but I'm familiar with those ideas. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I mean, I've been reading Discrimination and Disparities, and related to what you guys are talking about, he points out a lot of cases where discrimination, it oftentimes backfires on the goal, right? The agenda of building a more equity, it actually disrupts that equity and equality. And so, or just the agenda or the goal of a nation. So he uses the example of Hitler and his desire to formulate the atomic bomb. And yet, because of his discrimination against Jews, he actually lost those who were contributing the most to the science behind the nuclear project. And so it backfired on him because of his discrimination. He's just pointing out how the fact that discrimination itself generally is not helpful. And especially when it's the government promoting that discrimination, it never works out in the favor of building up a nation, right? To be more united. Anyways.
Well, same thing happened in baseball. Jackie Robinson. All the owners are racist. They all were, if you read their reports. But the owner, was it the Dodgers? I think, yeah.
There you go, the Dodgers.
Yeah, and I can't remember, but I did read that he was probably one of the most racist of all the owners, but he realized that was a good product. I mean, that kind of humbles me that at the end of the day, that's why we need Christ in that way. If I can get diverge on that, we're not all special here. And, it's just like these programs that the left really wants to do is not going to improve my humanity. I do need someone outside of me to improve me. That's why your program is never going to make me less racist. Anyway, Eric has offered, he said, left-wing programs like the Great Society initiatives, LBG, seem to make disparities worse. This should be a warning siren, not all do-gooding policies today be assumed to yield progress. Yes, I would totally agree with what Eric is saying there. Yeah.
Well, I'd even push it even more. There's actually, well, he calls them the anointed, but there's a certain kind of intelligentsia, there's a certain kind of elites who really do think that they know what's best for everybody else. And having been to those kinds of schools, that's a really real social reality. Quite frankly, a certain small sliver of people do tend to have incredible power in certain institutions, and they do have the very other view. They don't have this more constrained view of human nature, where they essentially have a humbler and more empirical way of looking at, if you put something in place, hey, you should respect the fact that there's going to be unintended consequences, and it's almost never going to quite turn out the way you think. That this kind of social engineering from the top down of people who think they know what's good for everybody, we should have some really serious skepticism about that. And in general, America's been pretty good at being able to undermine that spirit. I mean, we're a decentralized country, 50 different states, federalism, etc. But nonetheless, people who have a certain kind of education and certain kind of it's interesting how people who have certain families and tribes who have had power, especially at the beginning, it's strange how that tends to last throughout the generations, but it does tend to do that. And yet, willingly allowing that kind of legacy of past power to be undermined by new and future meritocracy, I think that's actually really, really, it's one of the really good things about American culture. And I think it's in trouble. It is in trouble, right?
Do you think they're going to force the NBA to be half white and half black?
Well, I mean, that's I often think about that. Like
just curious.
Like we recently had what's his
I
name?
hope not. We would get a lot worse players, and I don't
Exactly.
think I'm not definitely not being anti-white saying that. Just like
I was watching.
there are some good white players though, like right, but not
the
many.
MVP's white.
Yeah, and, that's true. There's like one every 10 years.
If you ever watch,
is that because of racism? Right.
If you watch, I was watching Doncic, and I was going, "Oh my goodness, this white guy is going to is like in the next 2 or 3, he's going to be the best player in basketball."
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, he's good. So he's really good.
It's because. Well, it's because they're just like, I want to win basketball games, and like, do they really care if he's white? At least I hope they don't care. They probably shouldn't care. If I'm the basketball team owner, I wouldn't care. But like that's really kind of where we're at in so many places. But it's like it's hard for us to accept that kind of like excellence at a certain level in some pursuit doesn't come with like, well, it's going to be 75% white and 10% black. I mean, it's not going to fit those kinds of like so-called proportional representation because it's just not how it works. That's just not how reality works, right?
How does this helpful for to close? I mean, I know we have to go. Sorry. As a minister of the gospel, just our love for soul, and I'd love to hear your closing thoughts on this. I mean, how is this? And Brad, you too. I mean, how is this for y'all as ministers of the gospel? I could talk a little bit as a counselor how it helps me, but I mean, I'm just curious why that's edifying for y'all, and how it helps you, and not that you're
something like soul.
Yeah, just curious. I mean, I not that you're equating soul with the Bible or anything, but I mean, how is it an edifying process for you? Yeah, just curious.
Just to jump in real quick on that too, before we totally conclude, you had mentioned a few resources on kind of a different approach to cultural issues, or at least resources from Aaron Meyer, the culture map, and then David Livermore. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I think that does lead us exactly where Peter was saying, toward a solution that maybe Soul doesn't quite provide, right? Yeah. Soul gives us the critique, but doesn't really bring us to a solution. So, and then specifically, maybe how has, as Peter said, how has that been incorporated in your ministry as you tried to use those resources?
Right. I mean, like Soul doesn't give us. I mean, you can say that if you read between the lines, he implies a lot of things, right? Like, hello, it's really good if your family stays intact, right?
Yeah.
And and I would even say, do you really need Soul to teach you that? I'll just say this before we move on to Aaron Myers. Like, I did a series on biblical justice last fall, and I knew that when I got to the middle of the series, I was going to say there's retributive justice, and if you're not a just person, God's going to burn you. Hello. That's why pastors generally don't like preaching this part, right? Because the Bible's very clear on that. But then but then there's restorative justice. That's the part where God gives us his grace and his mercy and his kindness. But in the restorative justice, there's a threefold emphasis on the fatherless, the widow, and what he calls the sojourner. The ESV translates the sojourner. I don't know if it's the best translation for us. I said kind of the excluded minority. That's the way I put it in the preaching. But just that first bucket, the fatherless, does anybody think about that today? One of the reasons why progressive activists who like to talk about justice don't want to talk about, two-parent households is because it's a lot of the same progressive activists are the ones who are destroying the family through the idolatry of sexuality. And so we want to have some kind of like just cause by justice over here, and then we'll call it oppression. But wait a second, if we actually look for some kind of more empirical solution, like how about let's restore the family, right? And one of the things that I would love to just see is, I think if like let's just if poor Black America, poor Hispanic America, poor white America, which they're suffering a lot of these same problems. I don't know if you've ever read the book Hillbilly Elegy. It's an incredible read, right?
I've read the reviews of it and watched the movie.
Yeah, book is way better.
I'm sure.
Right? But again, it goes to the issue of dads. Does our society know how to produce men who are not violent, men who are sexually faithful, and who will love and cherish and equip their children, right? And that's not even like apart from the gospel, right? But that's what the Bible calls for. And I think if the poor minority folks would follow that plan, we don't really need all this other agendas. Okay. Now let me say a little something about what you're asking for, Peter. I really want. Okay, I have no commission from plugging this book. I'm just telling you that. I love this book, The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. I've read multiple books or looked for resources like this. And I finally, I think this is the best one that I've yet come across. And what Aaron Meyer does is, so just for those of you who don't know, Aaron Meyer is, she's American, and she's a cross-cultural expert that teaches in an international business school in Paris. Her husband is French. So all her students are global business leaders from all around the world. She's like Singaporean leaders, French leaders, American leaders, Chinese. I mean, like they're Russian, Israeli. They're coming from all around the world. So she's not talking in terms of just theories here. She's not giving you some psychology or sociological theory. She's giving you realities that she's tested, and then you're talking about business leaders. They don't want some theory. They want something that's real and that works. So that when they go back to their company and you're like, okay, here's my team. That guy's Dutch, that guy's American, this guy's, like this from Nigeria. How do I make this work? Right. And what she does is she takes you through like 8 different facets of how cultures do different things. So let me just give you an example of one. Chapter 2 is, Chapter 2, evaluating performance and providing negative feedback. Okay, she calls it the many faces of polite. And so what she shows you is that on a spectrum, what you have is, so just for example, the previous chapter is about what she calls low context versus high context language. And low context language means that you're basically blunt. Okay, the context is low. We don't have a shared context. Therefore, you just have to say things in a direct way. So, the obvious contrast here would be like Japan would be high context language. They speak in a kind of subtle way. Like if they ask you, if you ask, could we do this? And the Japanese person goes, we will try. We will try basically means it's not going to happen, man. Right? That's a super polite way of saying, probably not. But they say it in this very more subtle and very, very polite way, right? And then whereas like Americans are like, no way in hell, it's not going to happen, man. It's very direct, low context language. And one of the points that she makes is if you have if you have kind of a multi-ethnic and multicultural like gathering, what you have to do is you have to use low context language because you don't have a shared understanding and a shared culture. Can everybody do it the way the Koreans do it, or everybody do it the way the Russians do it? No, just kind of have to get it to the lowest common denominator, which means direct language, right? So everybody kind of knows Americans are very direct, low context speakers, but this chapter 2 is about how do Americans, okay, not just Americans, how do people do negative feedback? So when I read this chapter this happens apparently in the business world all the time. So people are like, let's say they're from Asia and they just like, okay, white Americans, they're direct speakers. They use low context language. That's how they talk. They're blunt people, right? Great. Everybody knows Americans are blunt people. So then when they do you're going to do like feedback in your business team, they expect that the white American is going to be blunt. But guess what? Not so. On the spectrum of like very blunt versus like very, very kind of like very sensitive, America is right in the middle. If you look at so to a lot of people, they show up so for instance, the Dutch are very, very blunt. The Dutch have this view like, hey, did I do a bad job? Well, I'm not a child, man. If you don't talk to me and really tell me what I did wrong very, very clearly, dude, they actually get offended because they consider it a form of condescension, right? And so, but the Dutch, when they find out that Americans don't operate that way, they're kind of shocked, right? So here's this thing that you think that direct language, blunt language, low context language would also translate to a kind of blunt and direct, negative feedback. but that is not the case, you know?
Wow.
So like that's, I'm just using that one because like we're talking about white folks and white folks. So here's another good example that gets us back to race. If you meet a person whose background is more Dutch, let's say they're from the Midwest, they're from like Michigan and they're like Dutch, third generation Dutch background, and you meet someone who's got, let's say they're more Anglo-Saxon background on this issue, they may differ and they're both white. And here we go on something of culture that's, where like this white tribe and this white tribe, well, they actually differ quite a lot. And so this is what I would like us, in my church, I basically sit in front of my people and read this book. I'm going to probably make all of my elders read this book. And there's no way anybody of us can master all this stuff, just no way. But if we could just pick up a couple here and there, especially whoever is in your midst, I have lots of Indians in our neighborhood. And so you can go on the website, and what they do is on the 8 different factors, what they do is they actually map it. So, you can like type in Korean and then they'll give you like a map. Like the Korean map tends to be over here. The American map tends to be over here, by the way, right? It's like, in other words, American and Korean culture, they just have very deeply intuitional different habits. But this is interesting. When we threw the Indian map up there, you know what happened? The Korean map was like this. The Indian map was really close. And I looked at that and I said, oh, well, on the outside, they look brown and they're from South India, South Asia and stuff like that. But kind of on the inside, they're actually a lot more similar to us Koreans. And that's one of the things I like, just as an example of something I would like our church to get, my church is probably like about 75% Korean, 25% other. Okay. I have a friend whose church is probably like about 80% Indian, 20% other. Both of our churches want to become multi-ethnic, reach the nations. That's actually the mission tagline of our church, New Life in Christ for the nations of Silicon Valley. We're super diverse out here and a lot of immigrants. So one of the things I would love to do is to just get my people to pick up just a few things and learn something that they don't know. And like one of the things they might find out is like Indians seem really, really different than us. They're brown and aren't they mostly Hindu, etc. But actually, if you get into their life, you're going to find out that a lot of your like relational and like expectations, they actually align very, like if you're Korean American, it's probably going to align pretty well to Indians. And in my own personal experience, that has turned out to be true. Yeah. And so like that's like a beautiful thing to find out. And hopefully like my folks who tend to be more from East Asia will go, oh, really? You know what? I should just get really like happy and comfortable around, South Asian folks. And it'll probably be more of a layup for me to try to reach them for Jesus than maybe somebody else. So like, that's just one kind of takeaway that I'd hopefully like to see.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That's great.
That is good.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing, and I know we got to close this up because we got to go, but you mentioned one other resource, and I don't know if you want to say something briefly about that, David Livermore and the great course.
Okay. So I'll just say that's the other thing that I found. It's called, I think the actual title of the class is called Customs of the World. Customs of the World Using Cultural Intelligence to Connect, something like that, right? And David Livermore is a professor from, I want to say, University of Michigan. And this is his expertise. He's lived all around the world. So they call this thing cultural intelligence. And he basically does a similar thing, except it's on video. So if you don't want to read a book, this is a good way to go. You can get this Customs of the, get this. Obviously, it's an expensive video if you want to buy it. But I would just suggest you, like wait for a sale and then this price will go down and then buy it for your, or you could, again, I'm not being paid for this. All right. You could just, I think they have like a Netflix type subscription for the great courses, and then you get all their content for like $15 a month. Now, I just want to plug one thing toward the back of that class. In the back of that class, here, let me see if I've got it here. In the back of that class, I looked it up actually. In the back of this class, he has a bunch of lessons, and this is kind of how he breaks up the different cultural groups of the world. He has, he calls them, he starts with Anglo cultures. America is obviously more of an Anglo culture, even if you're Black, hello, you're an Anglo culture, okay? At least an Anglo-dominant culture, right? Nordic Europeans, Germanics, Eastern European and Central Asian, Latin European, Latin American, interesting, he separates those two, Confucian Asian, South Asian, Sub-Saharan African, and Arab culture. So he has a lesson, he has a whole lecture on each one of those kinds of groups, and he tells you kind of what those kinds of people are more like. And so if you want something more like a 30-minute lesson, say on like South Asians, you could watch that lecture, and if you don't really want to read that book. So I actually think just for those 8 or 9 lectures alone, that class is worth it. All right.
That's great.
That's great.
That's great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I learned a lot. It was very good. It's so cool that y'all are in all these. We're in such different areas, and Silicon Valley and Northern California and Boston. So if we can encourage all the people that are, in the middle of the country to keep persevering. So don't become. But I really appreciate it.
I just like to say is like sometimes I do. Maybe this would be like, I probably sound like some flaming conservative or something like that. Right? I live in the Bay Area. It's super diverse out here. And, obviously, we're quote unquote more gay, but like the gay agenda is spreading all over the country. But I think one of the things I really do want to say is it's pretty shocking for some of the people from my neck of the woods when they go to around the country and then they just see like everybody in this neighborhood is white. Oh, wait a second. Everybody in that neighborhood is black. Mm-hmm. And so it is, I do think we do need to have compassion and understanding that like the deep seated like habits and, like where the different races and cultures just try to stay in their like quote unquote in their little lanes. That's ending and breaking in America right now. And I think in very good and needed ways. And I just wish, people didn't have these political agendas. It's kind of like if we just be a little bit more patient, in about 20 years, way more white people are going to marry way more black people. And then everybody can relax a little bit more. We'll have more Patrick Mahomes. Okay. Right. Yeah. And so like, I
think I was more saying, don't envy us living here. I think
that's one thing I just would love to say to your audience is I do think we're actually going.
Although I do like where we are. Yeah, it's kind of cool. It is.
It's just, I hope people wouldn't politicize it, and we would be a lot more, patient. When my white pastor and like ruling elder friends asked me, "Hey, SooSang, you got any advice for us?" Like our church is like 98% white. I would say, I was like, in your city, the black people are all like a mile and a half away. One of the things I would do is, why don't you call up the senior pastor of the black church, that's 2 miles away from you and say, hey, can we have a fellowship event? Or like, can we start a friendship? So instead of trying to solve all justice issues or whatever, why don't we just start with friendship? Let's start with trust. Let's be brothers.
Yeah.
And so instead of like looking at each other, it's like, you're black, I'm white, you're different, you're over there, we're over here. Like, and why don't we start with, you believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, we love Jesus, you love Jesus, therefore we want to love you, and like, let's learn to actually walk together and be friends and love each other and build mutual trust and respect. And then maybe we can find some win-win places where we could serve together and our people can walk together. And then, like, who knows what will happen from that? That's kind of the way I'd like to see us go. Yeah. That's kind of happening in our presbytery, and I'd like to see more and more of that. And I think that's one of the things I'd just like to commend to some of your listeners out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for the word. Yeah, appreciate that.
Such a radical concept, treating others as you want to be treated, befriending your neighbor.
And they're Christians too. Hello, they're family. Like,
right.
Let's treat your family like family, right?
Amen. It's
good. And y'all could find SooSang at revivepres.church. I believe that's the website.
Yeah.
So,
is there? Do you have any other? You have a YouTube channel, but
we do have an Instagram channel, which, of course, since I'm too old, I don't really know how that works. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sure they can just. Yeah, I think y'all have an Instagram. Y'all do have an Instagram. Yeah. Revive.
Find us on Revive Presbyterian Church on YouTube.
It's Revive Pres. Church.
So
revivepres.church is our website, and you can find Revive Presbyterian on YouTube.
Nice.
And then all the links are at the bottom. Yeah. It was a pleasure talking to you, SooSang. I'm sure we'll keep the conversation going at presbytery level and in our committees, but look forward to just seeing how the Lord works through these issues and allows the church to, I guess, get more grounded and have an ability to stand against a culture that is increasingly more and more chaotic and secular on these issues.
Thank you again.
All right.
Good talking to you, man.
Guys. Hope this is a blessing. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Yes, very much. Yes, thank you.